basic overall public housing concepts, and we want to keep it at a fairly high level. I think any of these topics would warrant training of its own that could last for days, but we're going to try to keep it short and then possibly take some questions at the end if you want to dig down a little bit deeper. And I think we're going to have some instructions on how to use the live meetings.
Yeah, so for those of you who aren't familiar with GoToMeeting, you'll be able to raise your hand and ask questions live. And to do that, you'll see there's a little hand icon on your control panel. So click that. We'll see your hand come up, and we'll unmute you, and you can ask your question. You do have to be signed into the audio. So there's an audio pin on your control panel. If you haven't entered that, you're going to need to enter that. Otherwise, we won't be able to unmute your line.
Okay. With that, the first module, I guess, that we're going to cover is just really kind of what we call the basics, like what is public housing, what is a public housing agency, kind of what gives us the legal authority for housing authorities and PIHs, what are those governing documents, what are the most common HUD programs. We're going to talk a little bit about the Section 18, which is demolition and disposition. We're going to talk about the release of the DOT, which is the Declaration of Trust. We're going to talk about mixed finance public housing, the annual PIH plan, and we're going to talk a little bit about FAS. So before we start that, let me just tell you a little bit about myself. I have been with the department for 26 years, and I started in the Phoenix office as an urban intern back in 1989. I think it was the last class. And we did the rotation through all the offices. At the time, HUD had mortgage credit and was doing like their own underwriting, and HUD had their own appraisers, and everybody was rotating through and thought those areas were much sexier to be a part of in HUD. I immediately fell in love with public housing authorities, and everybody thought I had lost my mind, which is probably true. But anyway, and so I have been with this particular program in a variety of fashions over the last 26 years. So that's a little bit about me and probably why I'm a little bit nutty about some of the nuances of our programs. So what is public housing? So public housing is a federal program that is a federal housing rental assistance program. Each state has a charter that they usually operate under the law for their state. Each agency has provisions with local governments to kind of operate within their own jurisdiction. The one exception to that is the state of Massachusetts, which has a very strange law that says if you are a public housing authority in the state of Massachusetts, you can operate anywhere in the state and you do not have to respect jurisdictional boundaries. As far as I know, that's the only state that operates like that. Everybody else is very respectful of everybody else's boundaries. Currently, tenants residing in public housing pay no more than about 30% of their adjusted gross income towards rent, which I think is pretty much similar. It's governed by Part 5. I think it's pretty similar in housing programs as well. But this has not always been the case in public housing, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. And the additional operating capital costs that are sometimes associated with the rental properties are paid by HUD. So basically what we're saying, in addition to the tenant rents, HUD sort of kicks in operating subsidy and capital funding associated with the needs for these properties. And needs we're going to use kind of loosely, tongue-in-cheek. So we're going to talk a little bit about what is the public housing agency, but I really want to back up, back to like the 1870s, I think, and talk a little bit kind of about history. I mean, for a long time, Americans have been really thinking about how to address livability in housing and how to address situations with slumlords. At that time, I think they had, of course, the United States was being populated with a lot of heavily immigrant population. And they kind of came up with a group, and they came with what they called a model tenements build, which really attempted to use architecture and management tools as a way to address some of the concerns. But of course, there were very limited resources, and with limited resources meant very limited results. The efforts were then sort of redirected toward enforcing and creating the building codes and building code reform. And the New York City was actually the lead and on the forefront of doing this citywide, creating the New York Tenement Act of 1895 and then the actual tenement law in 1901. And then this was later copied by Chicago, Philadelphia, and some other large urban cities across the country. And it really wasn't until 1933, I think, when Roosevelt's New Deal kind of came the first federal housing programs. And they directed the Public Works Administration. At that time, that was housed in Health and Human Services, I believe, the Department of Health and Human Services. And they decided between 1934 and 1937 to develop 52 public housing projects. I think today we would probably call that a demonstration. And although I've visited many sites across the country over the years, and many that are that old claim to be the first, but I think history sort of acknowledged that Atlanta's Techwood Homes, which opened its doors on September 1st, 1936, is officially considered the first of those 52 public housing projects. So another funny story about the Department of Health and Human Services is that I spent 17 years in the D.C. field office and did a lot of work with the D.C. Housing Authority, and when they started getting into the mixed finance business and we started getting into looking at what was recorded on their DOTs, we found that a lot of the property that public housing was built on had not officially and legally been transferred from the Department of Health and Human Services to the Housing Authority. So that was kind of funny, and some of those documents were pretty old, including that Potomac at that time was still spelled with a K. I thought that was interesting. But anyway, in 1937, then officially the United States Housing Act was created for the express purpose then of providing housing for low-income families. We typically refer to public housing authorities as, the Housing Authority of, Savannah Housing Authority of the City of Fresno, County of Fairfax, whatever. That's kind of the short version. So we're going to talk about kind of what was kind of significant legislation then, like in our history. The slide here has 3 items. I'm actually going to add a 4th. So the first one we're going to talk about is the United States Housing Act of 1937, and this temporarily replaced that kind of Public Works Administration housing division with a more permanent and quasi-autonomous agency to administer housing. And the new United States Housing Authority Act of 1937 had a emphasis to operate with local efforts and local housing authorities then to really develop kind of what was needed in their communities. Although, just for some of you that are numbers gurus, I thought it was kind of a funny side note to note that they did establish a national TDC, which was $5,000 per unit, and that was widely criticized. However, in spite of that criticism, another 50,000 units were still built with that TDC limit of 5,000 per unit. So to me, that was kind of a bit of nostalgia. I wanted to point out that the Housing and Urban Development Act, this is not on your slides, you might want to write it in. The Housing and Urban Development Act of 1965 actually elevated HUD to a cabinet level agency. and it was created obviously to lead housing. It introduced rent subsidies. It also was the first time we had like a little bit of a shift to privately developed housing and low-income housing, and it really gave FHA a broader range of authority to provide assistance and to insure mortgages with nonprofits for the first time. So although not on your slide, I still think that's an important piece of our legislation, kind of our history. The Brooke Amendment of 1969, we're going to talk a little bit about that later. It's sort of like the tale of unintended consequences, but Edward Brooke was the first African-American senator that was elected since the Civil War, and he was actually considered, he was a liberal Republican. Unfortunately, his amendment had sort of, it unexpectedly turned PHAs kind of into the slumlords that they were designed to sort of replace. But we'll talk about that later. And then the last piece of legislation is the Quality Housing Work Responsibility Act of 1998, which was signed under the Clinton administration, and it's most widely known as the Welfare Reform Act. And it had provisions in there that also affected our housing. So what are our governing documents? There has to be a state or local government charter. They usually have some type of bylaws. They sort of describe whether the boards are elected, appointed, a combination of both, who the members are, what the membership numbers are. All of that's laid out, and it gives them the authority to operate and kind of what authority the state agency and the state charter allows the local housing authority to assume. And those are supposed to be on file with the local field office. There's an annual contributions contract, which is executed with HUD, which gives us the ability to transfer money, and it sort of tells us what we're going to transfer money for, and it tells them what their obligation is once they receive it. We're, I think, on our third iteration of the ACC, and the last major conversion happened in 1995. The Declaration of Trust is the use agreement or the instrument that's actually recorded on the physical housing property, real estate. The cooperation agreement, I mean, this is usually entered into with the state and other localities. I can give you a local example here. In our area, we have Fairfax County, which is a pretty large county. Consumed in the county boundaries are two cities. One is the city of Fairfax, and one is the city of Alexandria. The city of, and each of those cities then is sort of their own jurisdiction. The city of Fairfax entered into a cooperation agreement with the county of Fairfax to say, we don't want to have our own housing authority, but we really want you at a local level to operate public housing and redevelopment, Section 8 activities that need to happen kind of in our jurisdiction as well. The city of Alexandria said, we'll do our own, so even though they're a city government, they have their own. So those cooperation agreements sort of tell and give housing authorities, you know, what areas they're going to be mindful and respectful of, with the exception of the state of Massachusetts. Payment in lieu of taxes is negotiated with each locality. Public housing typically pays 0 to a very small amount of real estate taxes, but in turn the city still agrees to pay a certain amount of resources, and a lot of times that's the way that the city can make a contribution. And we also require a general depository agreement between HUD and the Housing Authority, which basically says you will not do bad things with HUD's money, and the money that's deposited by HUD will be used for its intended purpose. So that's kind of what those are the real basic documents that go with. So we'll come back and talk a little bit more about the DOT, but we're going to let Daryl say something. Like we had a question here locally. So what are some of the most common programs in public housing? Well, obviously public housing, which are defined by Section 9 funds. Capital funds, RHF are all under that umbrella of Section 9 funds. Real rental property that's owned by the PIH. There are some strange restrictions when we get into working with CPD that are specifically related to the home program that's under CPD, and that home funds and Section 9 funds in their true form cannot be mixed or used in the same unit. There are workarounds for that, but we can talk about that later in the mixed finance area. Housing choice vouchers. I think most of the folks on the phone are used to working with project-based subsidy. Section 8 vouchers are tenant-based subsidy, where the subsidy is given to the participant and they in turn go out and find their own house and it qualifies to be leased. But you're going to have a whole section on Section 8 with the Section 8 department later. We have the Family Self-Sufficiency Program, which says as your rent increases because you're in an employment program or some type of training program, the PIH is going to actually hold that amount in escrow for you until you graduate from the program, and then you're able to use that money as a down payment on a house or to go to graduate school, or if you finished your LPN and want to get your your RN. The program was designed to be completed in 5 years. History has told us that only those that are very aggressive can complete it in about 5 to 7 years, but that's a program we still encourage. We have the Resident Opportunity and Self-Sufficiency, otherwise known as the ROS grant, which really provides housing authority with resources like for caseworkers. There are many different models, whether they outsource or hire direct. One depends on the size of the housing authority and kind of what their model is. And then we have the Moving to Work program, which is a demonstration program that Congress authorized to basically say that provisions, including statutes of the Housing Act, can be waived under this demonstration. And basically, housing authorities were complaining that we were over-regulated, and they thought they could come up with better and more efficient ways to talk about how to provide and assist more families in more cost-effective ways, if only they didn't have the burden of HUD over them. The programmers won, and they can fund kind of their money. We found in the first part of the program, they fund their money mostly for development purposes. HUD was a little unprepared in its data capturing and recording, which would be no surprise to anybody at HUD, that can be challenging here in kind of capturing results of housing authorities and what happens. And but they're trying to rein the program in a little bit more, trying to force housing authorities to be much more accountable and report in an equitable way so that we can capture those successes and try to replicate them, which was really the intent of the program. Some housing authorities, such as Portland, which is now called Home Forward, have done a lot with their flexibilities, and there are other housing authorities which will remain unnamed, which have done very little with their MTW authority. So, okay, Daryl.
I am here.
All right, you want to talk a little bit about disposition?
I'm going to talk a little about disposition. Thank you, Belinda. Hi, my name is Daryl McGee. I work at the Special Application Center in Chicago, and I won't sound as good as Belinda talking about one of the things that used to actually do some of this revitalization of public housing. So our first slide deals with disposition. Pretty much it's pretty straightforward that when they say disposition removes a public housing project from the ATB, and releasing it from the DOT. Don't get confused by that. The disposition itself, the site gives permission for them to do those things. That's really something, a function of the ACC and the DOT. These are two important documents. And most of the times when they're dealing with these dispositions, it's just like anything else. They got a grant. They had to use federal money. They need federal permission to be able to remove it. Once it's removed, it's no longer it's terminated for the contract. And the DOT means that the federal government no longer has rights to the land and what they can do with it. So one of the big things that we deal with here is try to figure out what they're going to do with it. So we want to find out if it's going to be fair market. One of the things under the statute and regulation is that if you are going to do a disposition, you have to get fair market for the property, unless there is a commensurate public benefit. There's a reason why you're doing it that's going to benefit those in the community. It's going to benefit those residents. It's going to benefit everyone, including HUD. So we judge all of those things. So you can go on to listen and tell you that what the neighborhood, the standards of the neighborhood, the viability of the project itself enables the PIH to develop replacement affordable housing. A lot of that's going on. A lot of the things we get for disposition is the fact that the housing authority itself wants to try another strategy to house its residents. A lot of the housing stock is old, so there's a lot of issues involved with that. So we're pretty cognizant here. The department is pretty cognizant of it. And we here at the Special Applications Center, we take a look at each one of these, sometimes in concert with those people at the Urban Revitalization District. I can't remember what the D stands for when I say URD. I'm accustomed to saying URD, so I never figure out what they are. And I know Belinda's part of that. So, yeah. But URD does that. They're the ones who, sometimes with us, figure out exactly what's a good strategy for them. Next slide.
Urban Revitalization Department, yeah, or division.
Department.
Or division,
yeah,
I think. Division?
Urban. It was originally Urban Revitalization Demonstration was the original name.
Oh, was it demonstration?
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought someone told me it was demonstration, and I couldn't believe that. It's I think it's division, but okay. Demolition. We do a lot of that. We do a lot of demolition. Basically, public housing stock is just not viable. It's not safe, sound, and sanitary. But because of the requirements that happened at one time, they had to do one-for-one replacement. That's just very expensive. They could not longer keep it up. So the one-for-one replacement is no longer required. But what do they do after they demolish the property? Usually they do the deal. They usually dispose of the property. Sometimes we have demolitions done. The housing authority retains the property, and they, once again, build upon the site. Once again, URD is usually involved in this. Our biggest thing that we're dealing with here today, especially for our conversation, is even though demolition is done a lot, it's really the disposition part that we kind of focus on. And we want to make sure that you understand that you need to get permission. They need to have an understanding of why and what they're going to do so that we can figure out exactly how viable it is so we can give permission. That leads us to the third slide for me. The release of the Declaration of Trust. As you can see, we wrote a lot here. So I'll go through each point because they're pretty important, and there's one point that I'm going to have to talk about a little more in depth. The Declaration of Trust encumbers the property and protects the department through a possessory interest. Now, HUD does not own the property, but we have an interest in such a way that we can dictate the actions on that property. That is what we use to enforce the ACC. When they talk about we're going to do this 6J, they're using the Declaration of Trust to do that. A very important thing. It also, in a lot of deals, because of the way we have this interest, a lot of the deals that are made especially tax credit deals, once again, URD, a lot of these things have to be redone because they do not want that type of possessory interest when they start to make these deals. So a lot of thought goes into this. We can control their actions. The department, we HUD, we can control their actions. That means that we control not only what they do with the land, but we can control the subsidy they receive and the income they get from tenants. We control all that through the DOT. Very important document for us. We actually study this very much. Each declaration of trust itself, we'll ask about that, when they request a release of the DOT, it has to be something that we've already approved. We have to approve the conveyance or the conversion with conveyance. And that's the reason I want to talk about this for a second. You're hearing a lot about RAD. RAD itself is a conveyance, but it's really a conversion. You are converting from one form of subsidy, Section 9, to Section 8, under a couple of guises, either under project-based vouchers or project-based rental assistance. In either case, you are conveying the land. You are conveying these things, and you have to ensure that the release declaration of trust, which we've been processing, a lot of them in the last couple of weeks, those things are done, once again, so that HUD releases the control of its ability to control the land. That's really what we're doing here. Each DOT and its release is specific to the development. We must know what we're releasing. We must know, and you must know what you're getting. We usually want a survey. We want to make sure, because things happen over the years. Things are amended, and I'm sure we've already brought up that you're finding out, from what Belinda said earlier, we may not have all the things we're supposed to have, but things in a different way. In Chicago in the 1950s, most of the records for the city actually burned in a fire. So how do you do these things? So it's a pretty complicated process, and it's very important on a lot of fronts. We want to make sure that we are actually conveying the correct amount of acreage or the property. We're not giving them something that they're not supposed to have. Two, we're making sure that we're conveying interest that we actually have possessory interest in. Those situations may or may not come up, but we're trying to be very cognizant of that. The release of the DOT must be prepared by the HUD legal counsel and executed by the authorized signer. We say that because most of the releases of DOTs are actually prepared by the counsel of the agency. We still look at them. So when I put it in there like that, we do examine them. We trust that our partners are giving us very good releases of DOT, but we do examine them. Executed by an authorized signer. Not just anyone can sign a release of DOT. You must be authorized in the department to sign a release of declaration of trust. As you can imagine, you're giving away acres of land. You're giving away rights. You're giving away a lot of things. One of the things you don't want to do is give away the rights to something that, in essence, that we're still providing subsidy for. We're examining some cases like that right now. Like all legal documents, it is the PHA's responsibility to record the release of the DOT. At that point, the county in which they're located recognizes that all of the things are legal, and that when any claims come, it's recorded in that county. Now, I don't know who's behind me, but those are my 3 slides.
Great. And Daryl, we actually have one question for you from
sure.
Kat. Are you on?
Yeah, and it was, hey, I'm not sure, I think people can hear me.
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, the only clarification I had was just for the RAD staff that's listening on is this very helpful overview that Daryl is providing us is for transactions that are not going to the RAD process as it relates to the Section 18 and release of the DOT. This whole release of the DOT, if this was a, quote, RAD transaction, would be part of the closing process.
Yeah, it's part of the closing process, but there's still a legal review and all of that.
Of course.
Release.
Right.
The other, this is Belinda. The other thing I wanted to mention is that We also require DISPO approval even for the execution of a long-term lease. So even if the housing authority wants to retain the ownership of the land, but they want to do some type of development activity where they would be entering into a long-term lease, we would require them also to have SAC disposition approval before they could enter into that long-term ground lease.
Correct. We do. We look at both documents. We actually look at everything. If it's going to be a ground lease, if we do, there's mixed finance transactions where there's still ACCs, where we do use agreements, things of that nature, where you're releasing DOT. We look at all of those, and Linda knows better than I do, that it still must come to us, even if it's a lease, just to ensure that the rights are transferred and you have permission. Any more questions for me?
No, that was it. Thanks, Daryl.
Okay.
Okay, so we can talk a little bit about mixed finance and mixed income. I probably should have rewritten this slide since this is where the house under which I reside currently. The definition of mixed finance is actually when an ACC project is owned by an entity other than the housing authority as approved by HUD. So, for example, most housing authorities are prohibited from their state to directly compete for tax credits. Therefore, they usually create some type of single-purpose entity, instrumentality, LLC, or partnership with a development company of some sort in order to compete for those tax credits. And then that ownership entity then would own the project. And again, all of that would have to be approved as a dispo through the SAC and all of the components. But really, that's the definition of what is mixed finance. It's when a project, an ACC project, is owned by an entity other than the housing authority. We finance a lot of projects. The most popular that we are still working on are obviously the Hope 6. Even though the Hope 6 program has sunset, there's still about $175 million left in our coffers. Some of that is from those that were funded in the last round of Hope 6, and the other is some very, very old money that back in the 90s received any-year money. The mixed finance concept wasn't allowed for public housing authorities until 1992 or 1993. Until then, it was kind of under the traditional model. This was the first time. This was really cutting-edge stuff in the early 90s. The other component that we're pretty familiar with and starting to do some work on is the Choice Neighborhoods implementation grant. They do, in their grant NOFA, publish the one-for-one requirement, and they have the option of either going traditional mixed finance or having the project go on a RAD platform. And we have had some go both ways. So that'll be interesting. But the biggest component of each of those programs is that they're highly leveraged projects. And so they're able to do a lot of really good things and really, in most cases, completely demolish and do new construction. Other housing authorities, however, are still able to do things under the mixed finance approach. They tend to do it in a phased manner. Mixed finance, doesn't come with any money, so they kind of have to, even though they're approved at the HUD headquarters level, they have to sort of sleuth around and piece together their own money, and with different money may come different affordability requirements and different types of programs, and including sometimes, if the market can sustain it, we do have unassisted market rate units that are mixed in. So that can be challenging sometimes to manage, and most of the time we have privately managed firms managing our mixed finance projects. We do have a development program if housing authorities want to redevelopment with public housing funds only, or they want to acquire units directly with just RHF or capital funds. They can do that, and that can be approved at the local field office, but that's if the only source of funding is public housing. If they use any additional source of funding through leveraging or kind of layering on, it has to come to HUD headquarters. The PIH plan is a product of Quora. Basically, all PHAs have to do a 5-year plan. Most housing authorities still do an annual plan. The capital fund rule that went final in 2013 decoupled kind of the reporting in the original PHA plan. The capital fund reporting was included in that. As of 2013, that has now been decoupled from that. And it kind of, the PHA plan is sort of a mixed bag for me. In the old days when I started with HUD, the PHA plan has all these requirements, as you see on slide 13 or 14. This huge long list of all of these policies. And in the old days, the local field office was really responsible for reviewing grievance procedures and assuring that they were in compliance, and reviewing admission policies and whatever policies the housing authority had, or whatever programs they wanted to implement. Now they just sort of include them in this global PHA plan. They go out for comment. We don't really, and we send them a letter that kind of says, well, we acknowledge and approve that you've met the terms of your submissions of the PHA plan, but we're not really saying that anything you've included in your PHA plan or blessing any sort of like independent approval of each of these components. And you know, it's kind of, you're certifying to us that you're in compliance, but if we find out later you're not, you're going to have to amend them. To me, it was, housing authorities liked it because it took us out of their mix. It did, one good thing was it put all of their policies in one place that is required to be made public. So it's kind of a mixed bag, but it is what we have. FAS, which is the Public Housing Assessment System. The 6J was added to the Housing Act, which said, well, now as a part of all of this all of these amendments, HUD now has to evaluate the performance of the Housing Authorities Administration in some sort of consistent and global way. 2011, they adopted the third version of FAS. Kind of focuses in 3 areas or 4 areas: the physical inspections, which are conducted by REACT, the financial condition, which is an evaluation of their financial statements, and they're required to submit their single audited financial statements, both in draft and once signed through their automated system. A review of their management operations and compliance, which is done a lot through their PIC reporting, and their compliance with the capital fund requirements. So those are kind of the 4 basic measures. Okay, kind of the next high-level section is the operating funds. And it's had kind of some different cycles. There was a way that public housing was before 1969. There is And this really was how that public housing was not built really to house the poorest of the poor. It was really designed to house the middle class. How the Brooke Amendment changed how public housing is funded, the performance funding system, which basically for 30 years went untouched, and then kind of what we have today, which was changed with CORA, which is the operating fund and the capital fund. So from 1937 to 1969, basically the federal government's money under the ACC really went to pay for construction and the development of public housing. The annual contribution went for the payment of debt service, locally generated bonds, and housing authorities generally paid for their operations out of their rent collections. And they were able to set their price. They said a one-bedroom cost X, a two-bedroom cost Y. Most families were married households. There were not these occupancy standards that says if you have 10 kids, you suddenly are entitled to another bedroom or two. It was basically on what you could afford. And quite frankly, then the subsidies to supplement the funding shortfalls were quite rare. In fact, that less than 5% of the subsidy that the department provided was ever used for operations. I mean, they were really able to sort of operate on their own. And then in 1969, the Brooke Amendment came along. Housing in January in 2015, when Edward Brooke died, Forbes published an article about how Brooke destroyed public housing with this amendment. And basically, the Brooke Amendment changed one side of the funding equation, tenant rents. So tenant rents were traditionally set by the PHA to cover their operations. At the time, I think the change sort of seemed innocuous. At the time, they were set to pay, tenants paid 25% of their income towards rent, and they were kind of arguing that they were aligning to what you might mortgage payment, that would be about the amount of income you would pay towards rent. However, HUD and the PHAs quickly find out that this completely redefined their income stream and quickly became insufficient for housing authorities to pay for their operating costs and their overhead. So the solution to the PHA's income shortfall now with the Brooke Amendment was the operating subsidy. So how did it work? It was pretty simple. The projected project cost of operations and overhead minus income collected from rents, and then you got the amount of operating subsidy. This new form required some new regulatory environments. It required a new form of the ACC. It required now HUD to sort of govern what was permissible in terms of PHA expenses and what could be requirements for operation, what were prohibited practices, and it really just created like this whole new level of regulatory oversight and supervision on top of the fact that it created a funding shortfall for housing authorities. How to predict just how much future subsidy a housing authority would need for any given year. And that became a challenge. And so basically they decided to establish a per unit formula based on some historical PHA operating data. And the formula sort of was balanced to be a well managed public housing authority. And this was called the performance funding system. And this remained in place with very minor changes for more than 30 years. So that's the way it was. So when did it change? It really didn't change until 1998 when QORA was enacted and created the new operating fund. And it modified a lot of things. 2001, it tied small PHA funding. For us, small PHAs are 250 units or less, to the HUD-assisted FHA expense levels. There was, in 2003, a Harvard cost study, which basically said we ought to be doing asset-based management for public housing during that time. And so as a result, there was 2005, a new way to create the operating fund formula with the project expense level. We refer to that there is a UEL, utilities expense level, which is the actual cost of utilities. There's a few add-on expenses, which they give for IT and audit costs. And then there's the MTW. So, budget reality. So whatever the formula, the funding has not always been met with its full need. With the exception of about 3 years, during the last 15 years, there's been a significant shortfall. Congress sort of views public agencies as public agencies and thinks that it's okay to short fund them because they are public entities. And they do that in the form of what they say are prorations. So if the operating subsidy is eligible for $100, the proration amount may be, the appropriated amount may be $95, meaning that the proration is 95%. So it's been very challenging for housing authorities. That amount over the years is sometimes not decided until 6 months into the year. Every time we have a late budget, it's really hard for housing authorities to project, you know, what their even shortfall is going to be when they don't get a budget until the middle of the year. There's also a slide here to kind of show you what those prorations have been. And, you know, they range anywhere from being 100% to 85%. And that's no way to run, I think, a housing authority when you're trying to make long-term funding stream, which I think is one of the arguments made for the ROD platform, is that it maybe stabilizes some of that for some housing authorities. So kind of what else changed by subsidizing operations? Really changed the relationship between HUD and the housing authority. I mean, originally the housing authorities set their own rents, and now HUD's required to regulate, and then once we get into that, we go overboard, and we have to oversee operational expenditures and prescribe allowable costs, and created a new kind of financial reporting. So kind of what had been traditional hands-off was now very, you know, hands-on. Over the years, though, there's been a variety, I think, of flavors of that. When I first started, we used a system. I can't even remember what it was called. I remember what it stands for. It was called MOC, but the large PHAs, we showed up like a HUD steamroller to every 3 years to review. And small PHAs then were reviewed every 3 years. I think we're a little more reasonable now. We use risk management, which has some risks of its own, and that there are some housing authorities now we never get to, but it's all a challenge. Oh, okay, capital funding. Capital bit about kind of the beginning of it, which was the Modernization program, CF, and the Comp Grant program. The CFF, the Capital Fund Financing Program. So from its inception, nobody really thought about what was going to happen to the wear and tear or the life cycle of building systems and major components. They didn't set up replacement reserves. They didn't. PHAs initially were able to replace most things with rent that it was collected, but then when it switched to the income-based rent, it reduced the amount of funding, and there was a lot more attention was paid to like the building of new public housing, probably all through the 90s. Or the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, and not really, nobody really talked about kind of the old stuff until there were some real historic buildings. I think Pruitt-Igoe was in St. Louis and Robert Taylor Homes in Chicago, where the poorly designed and the maintenance and capital needs were just so significant that they were really pretty much national stories. But in 1968, HUD created the Modernization program to sort of address failing systems, and that was like electric systems, hot water, roofs, and other structural components, doors, hot water heaters, plumbing fixtures, all kinds of things can be fixed, but mainly those that have like some type of a life cycle between 5 and 15 years were those that were targeted. Originally, when modernization first worked, they were 40-year development contracts. So basically, they extended the use agreements on the DOT, and they said, if you accept this money, we're going to extend the requirement that you have to commit to keeping the ACC units in operation. And so there was some negotiation over the years. They decided to just reduce that to a straight 20 years. The modernization was, you know, also kind of completely dependent on like whatever the housing authorities wanted to do. And some projects didn't get funded. I mean, there just wasn't, again, enough money to get to everybody. So if the money ran out, some things didn't get done, or they spent more on others. Then we sort of moved to the Capital or Comprehensive Improvement Assistance Program. So then this was not only dependent on their initiative. The small housing authorities, which was less than 250, they had to compete for their funding. But non-PHAs, for the first time, sort of got what we call formula grants. So they could kind of count on a certain amount of money for their projects and to improve what they needed. And their early years of those grants also were like any-year money, so some of them hung out for a long time. Then came the 90s, which was, again, we had an administration change. They wanted to call it the Comprehensive Grant Program. Basically the same thing with a new name. They were successful, though, in substantially increasing the amount of money. It has declined over the years. They have to spend it all within 5 years. And the small PHAs still had to compete for their project. The other thing that kind of happened in this time that I think was kind of significant for public housing, those of you that, if there are any of you that have been around as long as I have, in 1991 and 1992, you know, those of us that worked in public housing really worked for multifamily housing. We were under the Assisted Housing Management branch in the multifamily housing department. In 1991, 1992, we were pulled out, and public housing was made its own division. So for me, that was kind of exciting. The capital fund. Let's see. So the Quora created the capital fund. This has been interesting. So Quora created the capital fund, but it took 10 years to get the capital fund rule out, or more than 10 years, which I find odd. There were some short-term fixes and some short-term notices and guidance to keep quote-unquote HUD in compliance, but really October of 2013, when the new capital fund rule came out, it really incorporated everything that Quora had intended it to incorporate. And the operating fund then was devoted exclusively to public housing operations, and the capital fund was supposed to be devoted exclusively to public housing capital needs. However, because there's been a shortfall in funding, the appropriations language has been modified over the years that any PHA can use up to 20% of their capital fund for operations. In 2015, the appropriations language says 25% of their capital fund can be used for operations. I don't know if what that'll look like for 16, if that was just a one-time.
So it was a one-time only.
One-time only shot.
And there was one special waiver that if they want to use more than 25%
for
safety and security, they
yeah.
can request a waiver.
Yeah, I was going to say that. And then, but small PHAs that are 250 units or less, they can actually use 100% of their capital fund for operations, and
as long as they're not troubled.
Right, as long as they're not troubled. And many do that.
Yep.
Many do that. So capital fund formula was developed through negotiated rulemaking, which took eons, I believe. The formula includes what we call the replacement housing factor, which is a contribution made by the department for units that are removed from inventory in order to sort of help replace them. It's somewhat confusing, and in 2000, well, not for Alan and I, but it has a first increment, a second increment, and then it rolls for about 5 years. But it was kind of hard for housing authorities. But in 2013, the capital fund rule replaced RHF with something that was much simpler and kind of straightforward. We call it DDTF, which is Demolition and Disposition Transitional Funding. So there's also a chart that kind of explains a little bit about that. There were a lot of errors on the RHF side related to when they tried to accumulate their RHF grants, and there were a lot of errors made by both HUD field offices and housing authorities in what constituted an appropriate accumulation and what guidance was given. So I think as we spin down the RHF and get everybody over to the DDTF, it'll be much easier. I'm hopeful. So we talked a little bit about that the capital fund, that Quora had created the PHA plan. But again, I want to just re-mention that the new capital fund rule in 2013 decoupled that, and they now have a capital fund 5-year action plan, which is completely separate from that process. So that's the most important thing, I think, to remember out of that. Capital needs today, and this is like where our RAD folks are going to help us out. An estimated $25 billion in backlog of capital needs. There's a historic trend of underfunding of public housing operations. Even though public housing authorities can use capital funds to supplement operations, like it's just never been enough. There's less and less capital funds available to address the current and backlog needs. There is some people kind of latch on to the fact that there's $4 billion in operating reserves. a significant portion, they're saying, from unspent capital funds. You know, there's some restrictions on some of it. There's housing authorities are required to carry 4 months of operating subsidy in cash, at least 4 months. And historically, if it's operating reserves, every year a portion of if they have a large reserve balance, HUD does fund some of their current year allocation out of past year reserves. So I think we'll eat at that in no time soon. Let's talk a little bit about Section 30. Section 30 was also authorized by CORE, and it basically says that public housing authorities, it allows them, obviously with HUD approval, to mortgage and secure interest, authorizing public housing authorities to grant a security interest in public housing property or other property of the housing authority. So basically, that's physical property, the operating subsidy or future payments of operating subsidy and tenant rents. And for the first time, now it's saying that public housing property could be used to pay debt service, which had never been allowed before. And this is typically approved by the mixed finance team when they enter into a transaction like this. It sounds pretty good, and sometimes housing authorities do it, but the amount of rent that most housing authorities are able to generate don't provide much leverage for a very large mortgage unless it's coupled with some other tax credit or project, some other tax credit or mixed finance deal. But it is a tool that's in the toolbox, and some do use it. The other that I think has caused maybe some heartburn at times for the RAD folks has been the Capital Fund Financing Program. So far, the department has processed about 190 transactions. 247 PHAs have participated in the Capital Fund Program, and about $4.5 billion have been approved this way. And the transaction sizes range from 104,000 to 656 million. And the department allows for either pooled or individual PHA transactions. So really, what is CFFP? The financial structure and business terms are basically that they are able to borrow against their future capital fund formulas. They can borrow up to 20 years and up to 33.3% of their estimated annual appropriations. And they can pledge 100% of RHF? 100% RHF, yes.
As long as it meets the criteria you have on the screen.
Yeah, as long as it combined will not exceed 50% of the annual appropriation. So there are some housing authorities have done that. Some of the challenges that have been presented is that especially many of the earlier deals have a prepayment penalty. So if housing authorities wanted to switch to the RAD platform and sort of clear their CFFP debt before moving, they found they were 10 years into their CFFP, but if they wanted to advance pay the next 10 years, there was some egregious prepayment penalty. HUD has been able to encourage a couple lenders to waive that prepayment penalty. Not been successful in some others. I do know that in the most recent CFFPs that we have approved, we no longer allow there to be prepayment penalties when we review the documents. But there's no additional appropriation, so if there is a risk to the investor who's lending the money, there is a risk to the housing authority that if capital funds get cut off, the housing authority is still liable for repaying that loan. So there is still risk even with the CFFP program. So are there any questions so far, or are we all asleep? Okay.
Okay. All right, so if everybody's still feeling energetic, we're going to move on to talk about our utility cost reduction incentives in the public housing program. This is going to cover the energy performance contracting program in particular, but also I'll give a brief explanation of how our operating, the utility subsidy, or utility expense level as it's called, portion of the operating subsidy is calculated. This is, as Linda was saying, the utility expense level is part of the operating subsidy, but our programs here related to utility cost reduction incentives are in many ways a way of using operating subsidy to do capital work, because there's a $26 billion backlog of capital needs in public housing at this point in time. We do, and even though there is proration, as Linda was talking about, with the operating subsidy each year, housing authorities tend to be a little bit more desperate at this time to get capital dollars to do that modernization work and to get their buildings up to date and fully appropriate for human habitation. So we have these programs in which you can leverage operating dollars to do capital work, and I'm going to go over those. So, oh great, you switched slides. Okay, so the first thing to know about utility expense level, or the utility subsidy, is, and this refers back to one of Belinda's slides about the Harvard cost study. While on the project expense level, the PEL side of things, HUD is trying to assess how much a housing authority that is managing its properties in a responsible manner and an efficient manner should be spending. There was not a good methodology in the early part of the 2000s to assess climate is different, and so without an extensive amount of energy modeling of buildings, it was difficult to determine how much each building should be consuming in terms of energy or water, because it's so highly specific. So as a result, what was decided was that we were going to effectively reimburse housing authorities for what they do spend on utility costs rather than what they should spend on utility costs. It is an oversimplification to say that we reimburse them for their utility costs. It's a little bit more complicated than that in reality, but as a general rule of thumb, it's okay to think of it that way. But as I say that we reimburse housing authorities for what they do spend on utility costs, understand that that decision removed any economic incentive for the housing authority to be efficient with their management of their buildings and their consumption of utilities. As a result, what we have to do is to place additional incentives into the program to have housing authorities care about reducing how much energy and water they consume and keeping their buildings up to a high standard of efficiency. You can just, it's obvious, I think, if you think about it like a car, if somebody else is paying your gas bill, then you don't care how much. If you have a Hummer or a Prius, it doesn't matter to you. But if they then cut you a check for buying the Prius instead of the Hummer, then you suddenly have some stake again in having the more efficient system. So that's what we're talking about here with our utility cost reduction incentives. There are 5 utility cost reduction incentives that HUD offers at this current state. The first one is called the Operating Fund Benefit, and it is not a separate and distinct incentive that works as an add-on. It is actually integral to the formula in which we calculate what the reimbursement will be. And that is because as I said, it is a little bit more complicated than just a one-for-one reimbursement of utility costs. What we do is we actually take an average of your past 3 years of utility costs to remove any volatility that may be caused by weather changes, fluctuation in occupancy of the building, and things of that nature. So we will take that average to kind of smooth out volatility, but we'll compare your most recent year to that more historical average to see if you've been going up or down in the amount of utilities you're consuming. If you go down, we will share with you some of those apparent utility cost savings. The theory there is perhaps you did something as a housing authority, you made an intervention to reduce your utility consumption, and so you will get 75% of the savings that you've generated. You get to keep that. On the flip side, if you've gone up in your utility costs, you actually are required to absorb 75% of the increase that you have caused to have happen. And so this formula will give a very small, very, very modest bump up or down in your utility subsidy to either reward you or give you a slight disincentive for those up and down variations in your utility costs. The operating fund benefit doesn't have a great impact on housing authorities' behavior. In the end, we find that the amount of money it amounts to is not really enough to cause anyone to mean that the formula has a small economic incentive built into it. The second large utility cost reduction incentive that we offer is called the rate reduction incentive. Now, historically, this one was not used as often because before the deregulation of the energy markets in a number of cities across the country, there wasn't a whole lot that a housing authority could do to affect what their utility rates that they were paying to their local utility provider were. You had one utility provider, perhaps you had one electric provider, one municipal water provider, and whatever they said the rate was for a kilowatt hour of electricity or a gallon of water, that was the rule, and you didn't have much say in it. But there were some cases where a housing authority could negotiate a discount. Perhaps they would go to their local water provider and say, you are a fellow municipal agency water provider, and we as a set of public institutions have a real interest in ensuring that our vulnerable populations have the utilities that they need, a good reliable water source, and so why don't you give me a 10% discount on my water rate? And so sometimes that could happen. In order to incentivize housing authorities to do that, because ultimately it does save the taxpayer money and stabilizes the public housing program by making it more financially sustainable, we created the rate reduction incentive. So this rate reduction incentive, again, there weren't many things you could do to get it in the past, but now has become a major player for housing authorities in their ability to take advantage of additional cash through their operating subsidy, because now that there is deregulation of the markets, there are opportunities to do special wholesale purchases of energy, to do bulk purchasing, programs to get involved in energy hedging, and a whole suite of renewable energy technologies that fund those technologies can affect the rate that you're paying to your utility provider for your utilities. So this is now a housing authority is able to demonstrate that they have done something special and significant, and that definition does change over time because, you know, what at one point in time might have been very special and significant is now just sort of due course of action. So it does change over time with industry norms, but generally speaking, if you can prove that you've done something special and significant to reduce your utility rate, then you can keep 50% of the value of those cost savings that you've created each year, and that is each year in which that discount continues to exist. So there's no end to it. You can do it forever as long as you can prove that each year you did save money. The third set of incentives are working on the other side of the equation from the rate reduction incentive. These are the energy performance contracting incentives, and they focus on the consumption reduction. If you flip to the next slide, you'll see just basic math. And the utility rate, consumption times rate, or quantity times price equals cost. So utility cost savings for all of our incentives are calculated as the difference in cost is equal to either, if it's a consumption change, the change in consumption times the price or rate, or if it's a rate change, the change in cost is equal to the quantity times the difference in the price or rate. So again, we kind of have this split between our consumption reduction and our rate reduction. And the EPC incentives, which cover this consumption change part of the equation, are historically where most of our work gets done because, again, before deregulation of the utility markets, you, as a housing authority, had a lot more ability to affect your consumption than you did your rate. And of course, as technology improves with appliances and HVAC equipment and building codes and standards as well, housing authorities are naturally involved in doing work that improves the efficiency of their buildings, either just through due course of replacement and modernization, or because they've made a concerted effort to improve the efficiencies of their building. So again, in order to make sure that they are incentivized to take on those activities and to spend some of their capital work on efficiency type activities, we have this incentive program in place. You go to the next slide. Okay. This slide that shows the bar chart is actually an explanation of the operating fund benefit. I've already sort of gone over this verbally. If you want to take a look at it, what it's showing is that as your, so the pink bars are the PHA energy costs or utility costs, because it does include water as well. The yellow represents how much utility subsidy you're getting from HUD. So it is working on that 3-year average. So as the energy costs for the PHA start to go down, the utility subsidy stays high for a little bit. Because of that 3-year averaging process, there's a delay to when it starts to drop. Now, if that but before it does, and during that delay, you'll be getting over-subsidized for a period of time. That's represented by the green arrow. It says operating fund benefit. So that's, again, a little bit of overpayment of subsidies by HUD that is a reward. It's both meant to smooth out volatility and also provide you with a little bit of bonus for having reduced your utility costs. But then as you move along to year 7, 8, 9, if your utility costs have gone up dramatically, there is a delay at which the HUD subsidy catches up. And in those delaying years, you're being under-subsidized a little bit, and that's represented by those red arrows, the operating fund benefit, which is really detriment in this case, is you're being underfunded slightly because you're consuming too much, and so you're having to absorb the responsibility for that change for a period of time until the subsidy catches back up to where you are. We can go on to the next slide. So here we go with energy performance contracts. This is going to be the bulk of our discussion today. And this is very important for the recap office because public housing, because it's been around for a very long time, has had the opportunity to be in place through all of the changes that have happened in the architecture engineering world in terms of developing best practices around energy efficiency, water efficiency, healthy homes, and full holistic green building in general. The 70s oil crisis really kick-started, I think, a focus by HUD on what utility costs needed to be, and also on how housing authorities could, and this is happening in the rest of the market as well. How can you make buildings more energy efficient, more water efficient, healthier, and more environmentally friendly in order to ensure that they're performing in the way that we really need them to be. And so what we have in public housing, because it's been there through that history of these kind of focuses being wrapped into and the best practices being developed in the architecture and engineering world, is a lot of experience on the public housing side in implementing these types of improvement projects, and also even doing new construction to high green building standards. And so any new programs that we have at HUD really do need to take advantage of the experience that has been that has happened in public housing and figuring out how to fund these projects and how to incentivize housing providers to take on these projects and make sure that they are investing in the long-term sustainability of their buildings. So the energy performance contracting is the largest green building program of any kind at HUD. We are contributing about 25,000 housing unit retrofits to the bucket of green building work that HUD does each year. We report this through HUD Stat. So this is a 30-year-old program, and it's been around for a long time, and it's also very large and very productive. There are 4 fundamental rules of the energy performance contracting program, and if you want to get your EPC incentives, you have to participate in the EPC program. You have to apply and be approved to participate. And what it means is that you're going to be taking on a large retrofit project to improve the energy and water efficiency of your building. And in order to be approved, you have to show that you are doing, in fact, an energy and water efficiency retrofit, primarily through capital improvements. There are other things you can do to affect your energy and water efficiency, like facilities, operations, and maintenance work, improving the standards by which your facility manager is operating the building, and working on behavior change in your residents. But this program really was originally designed for physical improvement. You need to use third-party financing in order to fund the upfront project costs of your retrofit. And then you need to make sure to prove that the project will be cost-effective over the course of the EPC term, which means that the expected utility cost savings resulting from doing this retrofit need to pay back the total cost of the upfront cost of the retrofit itself. And so that makes it a cost-neutral program. And the maximum term in which you can get the EPC incentives and use them to pay back your upfront costs is 20 years. So under the EPC program, there are 3 incentives: the frozen rolling base, the resident paid utility incentive, and the add-on subsidy. Now, the frozen rolling base is our simplest incentive. It basically says, instead of doing this roll up and roll down of your utility subsidy according to what you're actually spending, we're going to freeze your utility subsidy at the consumption level that you were at before you started the retrofit. That way, when you bring your consumption down significantly, you are not seeing HUD drop its subsidy in correspondence. Rather, we'll hold your old subsidy level so that you can keep the difference in that amount of money for a period of time, up to 20 years. And you can use that money that you are saving to pay back your loan that you used to do the retrofit work in itself, and also to keep a little bit of money for other purposes, other operating purposes, generally speaking. So that's the first incentive. Now that functions on our PHA paid utility side. For the recap office, you guys know from your experience in the multifamily world and probably just from your experience with buildings in general that PHA paid utilities are not the only type of utilities that there are. There are also tenant paid utilities. In public housing, that it's not as common as in the multifamily world for there to be tenant-paid utilities, although we do think it's around 70-30 PHA paid versus tenant-paid utilities. And just like in the multifamily program, when we're not paying the housing authority directly for their utility costs, we're doing something that is a pass-through subsidy to the tenant called a utility allowance. To cover the bills of the utility for the utility costs that the tenant is paying directly. So the resident paid utility incentive works with those utility allowances to ensure that if a housing authority wants to do retrofit work on a building that has tenant paid utilities, that the housing authority will still get to keep the savings that result from that work in order to be able to fund that work in the first place, to repay the loan that they took out to pay for that retrofit activity. So basically what it does is it allows the housing authority, when they've proven that they have done enough work to reduce the costs that the tenant has to pay, they reduce their utility allowance that they offer the tenant, but HUD still continues to pay them as if that didn't happen for a period of time so that they can retain that difference in the amount of money and use it to repay their loan. So that's how the resident paid utility incentive works. The add-on subsidy is a third type. It also functions on the PHA paid utilities specifically, and is somewhat of an alternative to the frozen rolling base for those housing authorities that are nervous about seeing the savings showing up in their utility bills at the end of the year. They can do this alternative process by which we basically, we do drop their utility subsidy. They continue to have the roll down that you see with the normal utility subsidy calculation, but instead of having frozen it, we provide them with an additional subsidy amount designated specifically to cover their debt service on their retrofit loan, with the caveat that if they are not able to prove to us that the savings are accruing, then we reduce how much money we give them through that add-on subsidy. So these are really in the weeds, and you don't need to know all of this, but I think it's important to understand that we do have a variety of incentives that we provide in order to make up for the fact that we don't have a natural economic incentive built into the operating subsidy on the utility side right at this moment. So we have these different incentives that have been created over the years in order to ensure that there is an economic incentive put back in place. The next 3 slides show exactly how this works in terms of the money, but I think that it's a little in the weeds, and I think we should probably skip across to going on to how EPCs interface with the RAD program. When you're a housing authority and you're considering converting to RAD and you have an EPC in place, there's a number of complications that you're facing at that moment, because EPCs mean use the Section 30 program in order to allow some sort of encumbrance to be placed on the building. Not always, because sometimes banks don't really, I think that they recognize that they're never going to come back and repossess the toilets that the high efficiency toilets that you put in place. And so some of them don't ask for that security to be put in place, but some do. And when they do have to go through that Section 30 process to allow that security to be put on the buildings. But regardless of whether there's a security in place or not, you are a housing authority that has debts outstanding. And so when you enter into your RAD transaction, that's something that needs to be addressed. And moreover, one of the interesting things about the EPC program is that because you're doing it as a bucket of work, usually, almost always, you're doing multiple projects, or AMPs, we call them in public housing, asset management projects. You're affecting multiple AMPs with one large retrofit project. Some of those AMPs are going to experience larger utility cost savings as a result of the retrofits that took place in those buildings than others, because not all buildings function the same way, and perhaps you have a project, you have an AMP that needs a new boiler, which is extremely expensive, takes a very, very long time to replace, excuse me, to pay back. But in another AMP, all you needed was some new lighting and some new water fixtures. Well, those pay off very, very quickly, and they're very profitable. So what you end up with is cross-subsidization between the AMPs, where one AMP's retrofit activity is funding retrofit activity that happens in a different AMP. So when you go into a RAD transaction, if you're about to break, if you're doing what's known as a partial conversion of some of the AMPs that are under your EPC umbrella, but not all of them, you're creating a situation where you have, you're about to split apart properties that have been financially linked to each other and have collectively debt that they are required to repay. So that all has to be figured out. And so it is very much possible to do a RAD conversion when you have an EPC in place, but it's something that requires extra attention and something that requires extra discussion with your transaction manager. So again, full versus partial conversion. You can convert in the simplest way to move into RAD if you are wanting to take AMPs that are in an EPC to RAD, is to do the whole EP, all of the AMPs that are under the EPC umbrella at once, because then you will not have to figure out how to break them apart from each other. But if you need to, or have other reasons that you really want to break your EPC in part, take part of it over and leave part of it as public housing, that is also possible. But what you need to do is you need to make sure that the AMPs that you're leaving in the public housing side, that the savings that they're going to be generating, continuing to generate throughout the rest of the EPC term, that they'll be sufficient to pay off the part of the debt that is associated with those AMPs that are staying in the public housing program. What we don't want to see is that you're taking projects out of public housing, converting them to RAD, and leaving other properties in the public housing program that now are going to default on their loans because they're not getting the additional cross-subsidization that they needed in order to fulfill their obligations. That would be financially unsustainable, of course, but also just, kind of a bad practice. We don't want to, through your conversion to RAD, leave your public housing in a detrimental position. So there are different ways to address EPC debt when you're converting some AMPs to RAD. You can either pay off all the EPC debt immediately and by factoring it all into your RAD transaction. Sometimes, if you have enough operating reserves in your public housing side, you could pay off the entire EPC loan early using those there are caveats to all of this and rules about how you use your operating reserves. You can also, if you somehow had grant money, third-party grant money, not from HUD, you could use that, although I doubt that happens very often, or that we'll see that very often. And you can also apportion your project and pay off part of your remaining debt with RAD funds and part of it with public housing funds. Or you can pay off your EPC debt over time, either with the RAD funds or with public housing funds, or a portion of each, in order to figure out which is the appropriate method and which method is allowable within the framework of our public housing regulations. So you do need to work with your transaction manager to go over the specifics of how you're going to do this apportioning of your debt and addressing of the debt. Okay, so when you apply to RAD, and you have an existing EPC, you do have to identify that existing EPC debt as well as any other debt you have. You need to, let your transaction manager know whether you're going to be doing a full or partial conversion of your EPC project, and then the field office staff are going to verify the information you're providing against the records that we have about your EPC project. And the Energy Center, which is our office that does EPC reviews, is going to do a little bit of a new review of your EPC to figure out how much debt is left versus how much savings are expected to accrue in the remaining time frame of that EPC, how the money is going to work out, and make sure that you're not going to be left in a position where you're defaulting on anything. If you're doing a partial conversion, we do need you to submit your updated EPC documents, like I was saying, to the Energy Center so that they can ensure that everything's going to be financially viable after this transaction takes place, and the transaction manager will get involved as well to ensure that the way that you're planning to address the debt is proper and in keeping with the regulations. And you cannot, I think we wanted to stress this, you can't go forward with a RAD application unless you do make a plan to deal with this EPC debt. They will not allow you to convert unless you have a plan for how to handle this remaining debt that you have on your properties. So summarizing, yes, you can convert to RAD when you have an EPC, but you do need to make a plan for it and work with HUD to get that straightened out, because it is a little bit more complicated than if you were coming in without one. And that is it on my side of the utility cost reduction incentives and how they interface with RAD. If there are any questions for me, let me know. You can always email me as well. My email is julia.b@hustwit, HUSTWIT@HUD.gov.
Looks like we have one question from Kat. Kat, you're on the air.
Hi, thank you. I am a long-term listener, second-time caller. So the question I have was, you mentioned, Julia, a couple times that the field office would work with the Energy Center to highlight any applications and then deals that happen to have any EPC on it, and then the transaction manager got involved. So my question, obviously the transaction managers know a lot of housing finance, so they can certainly understand how to make sure that the finance shows the debt being paid off, whether it's at closing or in the following years. But I'm a little concerned about the final bullet point that said TMs will work with the Energy Center to ensure that, quote, the debt is properly addressed. Is the Energy Center and PIH field office going to take the lead on that, or are the transaction managers to be actively facilitating the wind down of the EPC debt?
It's a great question. We are, because this is all fairly new, I don't know that an official lead and support role has been designated at this point. I would expect the transaction manager to be at the front line of everything, and because really they have the perspective on the full RAD transaction, and this EPC part is just a subset.
Right.
But the Energy Center has a very specific need to be involved because unlike other types of financial transactions, what they're doing is they're looking at, they're confirming, well, one, they're confirming that the EPC regulations, which are highly technical and very, very niche, are being followed. Moreover, they're looking at the projected energy and water cost savings that are from the project and assessing whether those assumptions are correct. Now, you'd think at this point in the project, the EPC has been going on for a period of time, that those assumptions, those projections of how much savings we're going to accrue due to a retrofit project have already been made. But what we find is that the turn out to be, once the retrofit has been completed, construction complete, and repayment is going on. So what the Energy Center will do at that point is say, okay, your original assumptions when you came in 5, 10 years ago for approval of this EPC were that you were going to be able to pay off the project in 15 years. But actually, it looks like your either your project was really high performing or it was really low performing, and so you need more time or less time to pay off the EPC, and they're going to assess, they're going to kind of double check the architecture engineering analysis to estimate how much more time you need in order to pay off the remaining debt that you have.
So I guess sorry, I'm trying to take this from the TM point of view. So from a TM point of view, the Energy Center is important because they will be able to flesh out the or a low performer. They either owe $1 million or they owe less, right? That doesn't change based on how they ended up performing with the utility. Is that accurate?
It is, but the payment term can be changed sometimes. Now the bank will have said, and then that term will change.
Got it. Okay. So the next question I have, sorry, and I'm monologuing a little bit, but the final question I have then is I think you mentioned this really briefly, but there is a third-party lender, correct? So this is similar to CFFP debt where HUD might be able to encourage the lender to let the PHA to pay this debt off, but we're not in a position to require them to. Is that correct?
That's right. We can't require them to pay it off immediately, or the PHA can decide whether they want to do it immediately, possibly taking prepayment penalties,
yeah,
or continue along the originally anticipated schedule.
Okay, so I guess some of my takeaways for CFFP and EPC is first finding out who that lender is. That's really critical. Finding out what the existing debt is for both, right? And then reaching out to the Energy Center to find out what the estimated term is based on the performance, and then having the PHA figure out whether they're able to pay either debt off at closing or if they need to carry it forward. I think that's my takeaway.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Great, thanks.
Do we have additional questions?
No, last call for questions. Any hands out there? Oh, there we go. Will Levy, you're on the air.
Oh, Will Levy.
Will. Will, you might need to unmute your phone. Nope, he's gone.
Well, Will Levy is a great person to ask about RAD in general, obviously, but also EPCs and RAD, since he was heavily involved in developing these policies. So.
there any other questions? Looks like there are no more. Okay. All right, well, thanks everybody, and the recording will be posted on the RAD resource desk early next week.